This is Corey Franklin coming to you from Chicago with Remembrances of People Past, where we discuss people who have died recently and had a significant impact on history or society. And I'm with my co-host Carolyn Gilbert in Texas. And before we begin with our subjects tonight, Carolyn, you had something you wanted to add about Elizabeth Taylor, whose program we did about a month ago. What was it?
Well, I thought it was interesting in that the writer for the New York Times who had put together Elizabeth Taylor's advancer obituary actually died before she did, about 5 or 6 years ago. So another writer completed the final years of her life and added that to the obituary. And I saw a letter to the editor somewhere that said, well, how could this guy have written her obituary? Because it says he died 5 years ago. And of course, the editor then replied that this happens fairly regularly because the depth of advancer obituaries is pretty stout within the major newspapers. And if people just keep living and living, then sometimes the writer actually dies first. And this was an interesting little sidelight with some of our friends from United Kingdom, pointing out that the Queen Mum, who died at 102 or 3, something like that, and her obituary continued to be updated year after year, and she just kept on living. And of course, every time they did that, they would pay a freelancer or a consultant writer to come in and update, say on a 5-year basis, update the advancer obituary for the Queen Mother. So by the time she actually died, it was a very expensive obituary.
Just so long as we don't repeat that practice with podcasts. Our first subject tonight is Geraldine Ferraro, the first female on a major presidential party ticket, the Democratic ticket, as vice president in 1984. All in all, a remarkable woman, and I'm going to open with her legacy.
I was at the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco, and I was coming out, and there was a woman on a walker who was in her 70s, 80s, 90s, I don't know how old she was, and she beckoned me as I was coming out. And I went over to her, and I leaned in, and she said to me, and she whispered in my ear, I never thought I would live to see this day. That's what you saw that day, the excitement, the fact that history was being made. And we were all part of it.
Carolyn, tell us a little bit about Geraldine Ferraro.
If any of you who are listening to this might have actually seen Geraldine Ferraro in person when she delivered a speech, or if you saw her at the Democratic National Convention the year that she accepted the vice presidential nomination, you will remember her vividly. I have a vivid memory of her because in 1984, I was living in Dallas, and Geraldine, in her campaign swing, stopped in Dallas for a rally. Now, you have to remember that Dallas was almost 99% Republican. So those of us who would be considered left of center or Democrats came out for a rally at the Fairmont Hotel, the largest hotel in town at that point in time, and a very elegant presentation was made. And eventually, after several female politicians from the Dallas County area, after they made their comments in preparation for her, she did walk through the center of the room to lots of applause and smiles. And I will remember always that she had a very determined walk. She had great hair. Now, maybe men don't pay as much, yes, they do pay as much attention to hair as women do, but she had that naturally curly, wavy hair, blondish at that point, later, of course, turned silver. Now, I want to say she had a cute accent. And, of course, we know she was a New Yorker. She had a feisty attitude, and she was ready to take on whatever the Mondale-Ferraro campaign would bring her way. She was so independent that even I looked around the room that day, and I did see some Republican women in disguise who had come to that meeting just to see her. They had seen her reception at the National Democratic Convention, and I'm sure they were curious as to what they were going to have to do to go after that ticket with Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro. All through her political life, she continued to use her Ferraro name. Now, she was married to John Zaccaro, but she said she kept her own family's name out of respect for her mother. She didn't throw it around like some liberated women did. It was just her way of showing respect for her own Italian-American family, which she was very proud. She was the first Italian-American to run on a major party national ticket. She wore that very, very proudly. The nomination for vice presidency was not her first foray into politics. She was first elected to the U.S. House of Representatives and went on to serve New York's 9th Congressional District for 3 terms. Then she ran, of course, as Mondale's running mate in the 1984 presidential election. At that convention in San Francisco, the crowd erupted in cheers for her after she said her very first line.
Ladies and gentlemen of the convention, my name is Geraldine Ferraro. I stand before you to proclaim tonight, America is the land where dreams can come true for all of us.
That just took the lid off things, and the foot stomping and tears and screams of joy went on for over 8 minutes. Geraldine Ferraro answered a question that men had always asked of female candidates. No one asked anymore if women could raise the money, because she did. And no one asked anymore if women could take the heat, because she definitely did. No one asked anymore if women have the stamina for the toughest political campaigns in this country, because she had all of them. Even though her campaign was enthusiastic and very full of energy, there were some things that came up during her campaign. Her run was beset by ethical questions about campaign finances and tax returns, and then later about the business dealings of her husband, John Zaccaro. She tried to lay off all those bits of controversy to bias against Italian Americans. That probably didn't work. It was not going to be the answer to those. But time after time, there were various things that came up about her husband's business dealings, and then even later about her son's improprieties. So the two of them gave her a lot of grief. In fact, she said after the race that she would not have accepted the nomination had she known how it would focus criticism on her family. Sarah Palin was a little surprised by that as well, but this was 30 years earlier. She said, "You don't deliberately submit people you love to something like that." She said, this is Geraldine Ferraro saying, "I don't think I'd run again for vice president. The next time I'll run for president." Of course, she laughed at that because she was not going to do that. She did hope that she would live long enough. She knew she had this blood disease. She was hoping that she would live long enough to attend the inauguration of the first woman president. Of course, that didn't happen. She did a few other politically oriented things. She co-hosted CNN's Crossfire. She was a public relations person in a Washington area public relations firm. And then once she learned that she had blood cancer, she just made that comment that she wished she lived long enough to see the inauguration of the first woman president. But any woman, regardless of party affiliation, who achieves the presidency will do so on the shoulders of Geraldine Ferraro.
Well, she's from the Queens, from the district where around Archie Bunker was from, so she was a pretty straight-talking person. The line that I liked was, throwing Ronald Reagan out of office at the height of his popularity, with inflation and interest rates down, the economy moving, and the country at peace, would have required God on the ticket, and she was not available. I want to move on now to Warren Christopher. And Warren Christopher was a Democratic operative for many years in the Carter administration and the Clinton administration. And unfortunately, he was a well-intentioned guy who never had a lot of success. During the Carter administration, he was negotiating to get our hostages back from Iran, and he negotiated, and the Iranians finally released the hostages 1 minute after Carter was out of office and Reagan had taken the oath of office. It was a slap in the face. He had varying degrees of success when the Democrats came back into power under Bill Clinton in Rwanda, Yugoslavia, in the realignment of Europe, but he was never really successful there. Here is Derek Shearer, who was one of his ambassadors during the Clinton administration, talking about Christopher's philosophy as Secretary of State.
Well, he came in at a very difficult time, and he started out trying to engage various countries in Europe about the problems, first of the Middle East, which, as you know, is an ongoing and difficult one, and he made a number of trips back and forth to Damascus and to Tel Aviv in the area, trying to lead a peace process but not dominate it. Similarly, in the decaying Yugoslavia, he gave the European countries the opportunity to take leadership initially, and then as the situation deteriorated and no one stepped up, the U.S. did step up and take leadership and then ultimately use force via NATO, and he was part of all of that process, but he was a great believer in collaboration and working with allies and partnership. His view was that the U.S. was a force for good in the world, but that we should lead, not dominate, and so you can say that wasn't necessarily assertive, but it is often what, in fact, other countries want.
The final blot on his resume was in the 2000 election in Florida in the Gore v. Bush debate. He was the main Democratic operative in charge of Gore's fight to win the election in Florida. And unfortunately, the Republicans were playing hardball, and Christopher was trying to be a nice guy and stay within the law. And I think probably the Republicans would have won anyway, but Christopher's sort of passive-aggressive approach certainly didn't help there either, and Bush wound up winning Florida and becoming the president. Carolyn, any thoughts on Warren Christopher?
My memory of Warren Christopher, he was very much a behind-the-scenes guy. My physical memory of him was of this rather diminutive little guy who came to the podium, probably had to stand on a box. He was very crisp, even natty would be a good word for him, extremely polite, modest, had these great arching eyebrows that made him look almost quizzical whenever he began to speak. Now, he didn't mince any words, but his demeanor was very polite and very natty. I thought he could have been a poster boy for Arrow shirts. If you ever see a photo of him, he had those pointed collar, stiff collar shirts, and I just know he could have been in GQ or something for the whiteness and the pressed points of his collar and his Arrow shirt. I have just one other thing that I'll always remember about him. President Clinton, after flying no telling how many thousands of miles with Warren Christopher, made a comment that Warren Christopher was the only person to eat M&Ms on Air Force One with a fork.
You know, he may have had more success as an Arrow shirt model. Finally tonight, we also lost the actor Farley Granger recently. Farley Granger was a good-looking guy, was actually a good actor, and he had a promising career, but it never seemed to pan out. His two famous roles were in Hitchcock movies. One was Rope, which was a loose adaptation of the Leopold Loeb murder, also starring Jimmy Stewart, but the other was his classic, Strangers on a Train, where he plays with Robert Walker. Some of the most memorable scenes in Hitchcock, including a carousel scene and a tennis match scene, are in this movie. Here's a brief snip of the movie with Robert Walker as the psychotic killer Bruno and Farley Granger as the reluctant tennis pro Guy Haynes, who meet on a train.
I beg your pardon. Aren't you Guy Haynes? My name is Bruno. Bruno Anthony. Drink up, and we'll have lunch sent to my compartment. Want to hear one of my ideas for a perfect murder? It's so simple, too. Two fellows meet accidentally, like you and me. No connection between them at all. Never saw each other before. Each one has somebody that he'd like to get rid of. So, They swapped murder. I may be old-fashioned, but I thought murder was against the law.
It concerns your wife. She's been murdered.
Why, you maniac! But, Guy, you wanted it. Well, then am I correct, Mr. Haynes, in assuming that you have no intention of going ahead with our arrangement?
None whatsoever.
I don't like to be double-crossed.
Robert Walker is the creepiest Hitchcock villain this side of Norman Bates, and Farley Granger does a great job in that movie. Robert Walker, by the way, had a very turbulent personal life. He was married to the actress Jennifer Jones. She was stolen away from him by the producer-director David Selznick, and Robert Walker died shortly after this movie. Here, Farley Granger, before he dies, talks about the great actor Robert Walker.
He sort of went on a bender, really, and got drunk and was arrested and all kinds of things like that. And when Hitch called me out to his house, he was telling me the story. And he said, guess who's going to play the part? I said, I don't know who. And he said, Robert Walker. And I said, oh, Hitch, that's terrible, because he'd been arrested, for drunkenness and everything. It was the first scene was at the station here. We had been walking around, talking to each other, walking through the streets and everything, and then we went to dinner somewhere, and Hitch was there. We came back to the hotel, and Walker grabbed me and said, don't leave me. And I said, what? He said, don't leave me. And he scared the hell out of me, And I said, okay, come on. And the next thing I knew, the phone was ringing, and I thought it was mine, and it wasn't. It was his, and he was still out. And I called him, and I said, listen, Bob is not feeling well, and I'll be there as soon as I can. And, to start shooting. It was the first day of shooting. And I said, that, and he'll be okay later. Anyway, he did it, and he was wonderful. He was marvelous in the part. He really was. And we ran into each other, several weeks after the movie had come out. And he was very glad to see me, and he said, let's get together. And I said, I'd love to. Okay, let's do it. And he said, all right, I'll call you. And then like a week later, he died, and I was very sad because he was a wonderful, wonderful actor, and I respected him highly.
Their real-life relationship a little different than the one in the movie. Strangers on a Train, great movie. Robert Walker, great actor, and Farley Granger, who we just lost, a great actor. Well, on that note, I'm going to close. I want to thank my co-host Carolyn Gilbert in Texas, and I want to thank my producer Sid Tepps here in Chicago. And tonight we dealt with some people who had failures in their lives. Warren Christopher, Geraldine Ferraro, Farley Granger, Robert Walker. So tonight I'm going to close with a tune that reflects the successes and failures in life. It's a John Lennon tune sung by Judy Collins.
There are places I remember all my life, though some have changed, some forever, not for better. Some are gone and some remain. All these places had their meanings. With lovers and friends I still can recall. Some are dead and some are living. In my life I've loved them all.